But Mr. Currie has set his thumb upon the above, as well as other reasons that are adduced by the brethren in the foresaid paper to prove that the sentences passed against them were never materially rescinded. But, not to insist upon this, the case with reference to the ejection of the 4 ministers stands thus. When they came before the Commission August 1733, in consequence of the act and sentence of the preceding assembly, they not only adhered to their protestation and testimony given into that assembly, but in their several representations given into the Commission, they enlarged their testimony and stated the same both upon the proceedings of judicatories in Mr. Simpson's case, as also upon other palpable and heinous steps of defection. And they were thrust out by the Commission, November 1733, with this testimony in their hands. The question is then, if the brethren could return to the judicatories upon that synod of Perth and Stirling, upon what the synod of Perth and Stirling did by virtue of their delegated power and authority, without giving up with the testimony that was in their hands, when their guilt and crime was upon the matter still affirmed, and the execution of the sentence passed against them only averted upon some political considerations, and especially when a particular testimony for truth in opposition to the errors of the time is not to this day lifted up by the judicatories of the Church. As for the act with reference to the Presbytery of Dunfermline, it is affirmed, essay page 34, that, quote, the Assembly 1735 allows some of these parishes who had pastors thrust in upon them a liberty of church privileges wherever they might have freedom to ask them, which was a material testimony against intrusions, unquote. And in page 173, quote, as to the Act of Assembly 1733, annet some brethren in the Presbytery of Dunfermline, that act is materially rescinded, in regard the Assembly having left it to the Synod of Fife to do in the affair of Kinross, annet which was the act that was made. As to the admitting of that people to partake of church privileges wherever they should think fit, the Church of Fife did upon this allow that people to have the benefit of church privileges wherever they should think meet to ask them, unquote. Here I must notice that it is not matter of fact that the Assembly 1735 allowed any of the parishes who had men thrust in upon them a liberty of church privileges wherever they might have freedom to ask them. That Assembly did indeed remit the case of some of these parishes to the synods concerned, with this express qualification, that the synod should do what they found most for edification. And in the very same manner they refer the case about the enrollment of the intruders in some of these parishes to the respective synods. If that assembly had designed a material testimony against intrusions, as they would not have allowed the synods to enroll intruders, so they would have by themselves given the people the privileges of sealing ordinances from faithful and sent ministers, and if they had designed any material rescinding of the act, they would never have qualified their remit in the manner above mentioned. They would have declared that it was for the edification of the body of Christ that the oppressed members should have gospel ordinances administered unto them by ministers lawfully called. Besides, when the synod concerned have thought fit to allow them the benefit of sealing ordinances from neighboring ministers, it amounts to no more than this, that they pity the weakness or willfulness of the people who will not submit to ministers set over them by mere church authority. And when they consider that a secession is declared from the judicatories on account of their arbitrary proceedings, and that the people will have the benefit of sealing ordinances from the seceding ministers, they choose rather to allow them to receive them from their neighboring ministers. And this is the plain meaning of what is reckoned most for edification, according to the Assembly's remit, and every unprejudiced person may judge, if in all this there is any material testimony against intrusions or any rescinding of that Act of Assembly 1733 annet some ministers in the Presbytery of Dunfermline. From all this above represented, it is very much to be regretted that there is so much reason and ground for drawing the following conclusions, that is, that the present judicatories of this national church, on account of their proceedings and the many gross doctrinal errors that have been brought to their bar, as also in regard of a series and tract of magisterial, lordly, and tyrannical proceedings in the administration of government and discipline in the Lord's house, together with the countenance that they give to the dispensation of the word and sacraments by these who are not lawfully chosen thereunto, have not a just claim to the notes and marks of a true church that are given in our first confession of faith, whereby, as the said confession speaks, the church is discerned from the filthy synagogues. That is, the true preaching of the word, or the maintenance of the true doctrine and the true faith, the right administration of the sacraments and ecclesiastical discipline, uprightly administered as God's word prescribeth. And consequently, we cannot receive and embrace these judicatories, or, which is the same thing, we cannot warrantably join in ministerial communion with them. Likewise, from what is above represented, we may see against whom the charge of schism or separation is to be laid. And here I shall only make use of the words of Mr. Rutherford, as they are cited by Mr. Currie. Quote, "When the greatest part of a church makes defection from the truth, the lesser part remaining sound, the greatest part is the church of separatists." Do right, from Rutherford's Do Right, page 225, unquote. Essay, page 16, Mr. Currie seems to be jealous lest his citation make against him. Therefore, he gives his commentary upon it. Quote, "Surely he means," that is Mr. Rutherford, "of declared defections from the truth and fundamentals," unquote. And to prove this, he cites another paragraph from Mr. Rutherford. But whatever is Mr. Rutherford's meaning, surely it is a weighty and grave question. What are fundamental points, and what not? Our divines have been very cautious and wary in determining in this important question. Yet it is generally agreed amongst sound divines that the true deity of the Son of God is a fundamental article of faith. But how this foundation truth has been treated by the present judicatories has been already observed. This leads me to notice some just remarks of the Reverend Committee of the Assembly anon 1727 upon the 7th article of the second libel exhibited against Mr. Simpson, as the said remarks lie in their excellent paper containing the grounds why they judge the several articles of the foresaid libel relevant. The 7th article of the libel is, that, were it not for the prospect of happiness, we could not, and therefore would not, serve God. State of the process, page 277. Upon which the committee, amongst other things, observe that, quote, "What is set forth in this article is contrary to the instinct of the new nature the Lord endueth all his people with in regeneration." They add, quote, "Considering how much all men are bound to make the glory of God their chief end, though yet they are called herewith to pursue happiness, and that likewise it is through a prevailing respect to God's honor, and glory, and not a mere or chief respect to our own happiness, that the difference betwixt nature and grace is to be cleared to the doubtful Christian," unquote. They farther observe, quote, "that Mr. Simpson in his defenses only allows the seeking after God's glory as it conduceth to our happiness, which, say they, is a sacrificing all to the idol of ourselves, going only the length of foolish virgins, who may desire oil of grace for the sake of their own happiness, and that they may enter into heaven," unquote. It is so that a doctrinal point was before the judicatories of this church, by which the difference betwixt nature and grace is to be cleared to the doubtful Christian, and if any error contrary to the instinct of that new nature which the Lord endueth all his people with in regeneration, and which sacrificeth all unto the idol of ourselves, then a fundamental error, or an error striking at all the vitals of practical religion, was brought to their bar. Consequently, the judicatories of this church, in passing this, together with Mr. Simpson's other errors contained in the second libel, without any testimony against them, have let go a foundation point, or they have let an error striking at the foundations pass without any testimony against it. Further, I judge it will not be refused that Mr. Campbell's principle about self-love and self-interest is the same upon the matter with Mr. Simpson's, as it is laid in the above article. And if it is true that the General Assembly 1736 have adopted Mr. Campbell's principle as the seceding brethren alleged in their Judicial Act and Testimony, and they have given such reasons for this, as Mr. Currie has not yet disproven, then it may be justly concluded that an error which strikes at the vitals of practical religion has been adopted by that assembly. And what though it is true that some worthy and godly men do not see into the true meaning of the said act with reference to Mr. Campbell, yet it is still an act of assembly, and it must be taken in the genuine sense and meaning of the words compared with Mr. Campbell's principles. I do not think when Mr. Currie took the field that he had the least thought the dispute would have run so deep. I doubt not, but other questions of considerable importance will cast up when we come to engage more closely in the present controversy. The Reverend Mr. Currie is the first that has appeared upon the field against the Judicial Act and Testimony, except an anonymous writer in a paper published under the title of A Seasonable Testimony, etc. And to this paper I shall only observe that the 17 queries contained in the second part thereof are all taken out of the above-mentioned narrative of the Commission, published in 1733, except the 2 last of the said queries, and most of them are laid in the words of the narrative. Yet the author is neither so candid nor fair as to declare so much, and, as he takes no manner of notice of what was said by the seceding brethren in the review of the said narrative, so in the other parts of that paper he never once enters into the argument, though in the part he calls serious expostulations, he pours out a flood of words commending peace and unity, which are most desirable when they have truth for their cement and foundation. Therefore I humbly judge the seceding brethren had no manner of reason to take notice of it, though it was commended by some who it seems take words for reason and argument. I shall now conclude this postscript with a few general remarks on the Reverend Mr. Currie's essay. First, in order to discredit the Judicial Act and Testimony of the Associate Presbytery, he does what he can to defame and blacken the assemblies of our late reforming period. I humbly judge the brethren said enough with respect with what was detective in that period, when they expressed themselves thus in their Judicial Act and Testimony, page 18, quote, "But since the Church, while militant is in an imperfect state, it is not hereby intended to affirm, that under the above-mentioned period, that is, from 1638 to 1649, there was nothing defective or wanting as to the beauty and order of the house of God, or that there was nothing culpable in the administration. All that is designed by the above particular deduction is to declare that the Church endeavored and mercifully attained a considerable pitch of reformation during the foresaid period. Towards this, their several contendings and wrestlings, their solemn vows and engagements, their declarations and testimonies all pointed," unquote.